The wrench slipped from Sam Rourke's hand before the shouting even started, and later he would remember that detail more clearly than the words themselves. The small clatter of steel against the concrete floor, almost polite, almost apologetic, as if even the tool understood that something in the garage was about to break. "Get him out of my sight." Adele Sinclair said it the way other people ask for the time, flat, certain, a woman who had never once needed to raise her voice to be obeyed. She was standing under the service bay's fluorescent lights in a coat that cost more than the truck up on the lift behind her, and she was pointing, not gesturing, pointing, one finger extended like a verdict at a man in grease-stained coveralls with a burn scar crawling pale and old across the back of his right hand. She did not know that the hand she was pointing at, the scarred one, had once reached through fire and smoke and the screaming metal of a car that was folding in on itself and pulled her out of it before it became her coffin. She did not know that 4 years earlier, on a bridge in the rain, a stranger she never saw the face of had made a decision in under 3 seconds that every doctor who treated her afterward called, in their clinical way, the reason she was alive to be angry about anything at all. She did not know that the man standing in front of her, now absorbing her contempt with an unnerving and total calm, was the debt she had spent 4 years unable to repay because she did not know his name, did not know his face, did not know anything except that somewhere out there was a person who had touched the worst night of her life and vanished from it like smoke. All she knew was a scar, and she was about to make the mistake of thinking a scar was something to mock. Before we go on, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city or country in the comments. Somewhere out there, someone watching this has stood exactly where Sam Rourke was standing, humiliated in front of people who mattered to them, made small on purpose, and told to leave quietly. Stay with us, because what happens to the woman doing the pointing is going to take longer than anyone in that garage expected. And by the end of it, you will understand exactly why he never once raised his voice. Sam Rourke woke up at 6:15 that morning, the same as every morning, in a house that was too quiet in the particular way houses get quiet after someone leaves them and never comes back. He didn't need an alarm anymore. His body had simply learned the hour, the way it had learned so many other things it never asked to learn. How to check a room's exits before he sat down in it. How to load a truck bed so the weight never shifted on a turn. How to fall asleep in absolute silence and wake at the smallest sound that didn't belong. Old habits. Habits from a life he almost never talked about, folded now into the ordinary shape of a man who fixed transmissions for a living and packed his daughter's lunch every night before bed so the mornings would be easier. He made coffee, he made oatmeal, because Lily liked it with too much brown sugar, and he had stopped fighting her about it 2 years ago. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and watched her sleep, one arm flung over the edge of the bed, a stuffed rabbit with one ear worn to nothing wedged under her chin, and let himself have that moment the way he let himself have very few things, quietly, without drama. Lily was 8. She had her mother's stubborn chin and her mother's habit of asking questions that cut straight through whatever adults were trying to avoid saying. And some mornings that resemblance hit Sam so hard in the chest that he had to stand very still until it passed. Anna had been gone 4 years now. 4 years since the hospital, since the long, slow unwinding of a diagnosis nobody had asked for, since Sam had sat in a vinyl chair holding his wife's hand while she told him, in a voice gone thin as paper, that she needed him to promise her something. "Keep her steady," Anna had said. "Not happy every day. Nobody's happy every day. Just steady. Let her know the ground's not going to move under her. He had promised. He had built his entire life since then around keeping that promise, turning down jobs that paid more but asked for weekend hours, driving 11 minutes out of his way every morning to drop Lily at school himself, keeping an apartment small and clean, because a house where everything had its place didn't feel like it was falling apart, even on the days he privately felt like he might be. At the garage, they called him quiet, reliable. The other mechanics liked working next to him because he never left a mess for the next shift, never took credit that wasn't his, what none of them talked about because none of them knew. It ran from the base of his knuckles, up across the back of his right hand, in a pale shining ridge of old burned skin, and, if you asked him about it, he'd just say, "grill accident," and change the subject with a small, practiced smile that closed the conversation. The truth was that Sam Rourke had spent 6 years of his life somewhere the government didn't officially send people, doing work that didn't appear on any resume, and he had come home from it with a scarred hand and a private understanding of how thin the line was between an ordinary Tuesday. He had learned exactly how much noise a person needed to make to be dangerous, and the answer had turned out to be almost none. The men he'd respected most over there had all shared the same trait, a stillness that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with having already decided what they would and wouldn't do, long before the moment ever tested it. He brought that stillness home with him and built a small, careful life around it. Wake at 6:15, coffee. Drive Lily to school and watch her walk in the door before pulling away because Anna used to say a parent's job wasn't done until the door actually closed. Then the garage, 8 hours under other people's cars, leaving the rest of him free to think about nothing in particular, which, after everything he'd seen, was its own kind of luxury. He did not know, on that particular Tuesday morning, that the day would end with him fired, humiliated, and escorted out of a building by security in front of his own daughter. He did not know that the woman who would do it to him was the same woman whose life he had once held, early, in his burned hands on a bridge in the rain. He only knew, the way he always knew things, without needing to be told twice, that something about the schedule that day felt wrong. A mandatory all-hands notice pinned to the break room board, signed by a name he recognized from the news. Sinclair. Adele Sinclair did not walk into a room. She arrived in it, the way weather arrives, the way a decision arrives after it's already been made somewhere else and simply needs somewhere to land. She came through the garage's rolling bay door, flanked by 2 men in suits who looked like they'd been hired for their ability to look serious while carrying nothing. And behind her trailed a woman with a tablet who spoke only when spoken to. Sinclair Freight owned the garage, a logistics empire Adele's grandfather had built out of 2 trucks that her father had doubled, and that Adele herself, since taking the chair 3 years ago, had grown by a margin the business press liked to call ruthless efficiency, a polite way of saying she had learned to treat people like line items. She was, by every account that mattered to the people who worked for her, something closer to a weather system than a boss. Cold in a manner that seemed less like cruelty, he stopped first at the coffee station, where a young clerk named Priya was refilling the pot with hands that had begun, very slightly, to shake. "This is cold," Adele said, holding up a paper cup without having tasted it. "Do you understand that a cold cup of coffee at 7 in the morning tells me everything I need to know about how this facility runs? I can make a fresh pot right now, Miss Sinclair." I don't need a fresh pot. I need people who don't need to be told twice. She set the cup down untouched, exactly 1 inch from the edge of the counter, a small geometric cruelty that said she'd calculated it. Where's her supervisor? Sam watched this from across the bay, wrench in hand, and felt the old familiar tightening in his chest that he'd trained himself over years not to act on. He recognized the shape of what was happening. He'd seen commanding officers do it before, establish dominance on something small and undefendable, so that by the time they moved to the real target, the room had already learned to go quiet and small. It rarely took more than 90 seconds. Adele Sinclair did it in less than 60. She crossed the floor toward the lift where Sam was working, heels clicking against concrete, and stopped a precise, deliberate 3 feet from him. Close enough to loom, far enough to never be accused of getting too close. "You're Rourke," she said, not a question. "Yes, ma'am. I've read your file." She said it like she was announcing a diagnosis. 14 years here, never promoted." She let that sit a moment, watching for the flinch that didn't come. "Either you're the most invisible employee I have ever inherited, or you've been coasting on being liked instead of being useful." The garage had gone very quiet. 6 other mechanics had stopped what they were doing, tools frozen mid-motion. The particular silence of men who wanted very badly to look busy while missing nothing. "I do my job," Sam said. His voice was even. Not cold, just level, the way a man speaks when he has already decided the shape of his own reaction and isn't going to let anyone else write it for him. "That's the problem with doing your job," Adele said. "It's the answer of a man with no ambition, and I don't build a company on men with no ambition. I build it on people who understand that mediocrity is a choice. And every day you choose it, you are choosing to be replaceable." Her eyes dropped. Then, to his right hand, still resting on the lift's hydraulic arm, the old scar catching the fluorescent light in a way that made it look, for a moment, almost silver. "What happened there?" "Grill accident," Sam said. Something in the flatness of his answer seemed to annoy her more than any excuse would have. "A grill accident," she repeated, a small, cold smile arriving at the corner of her mouth. "You people always have a story." "I've built a company by not believing convenient ones, Mr. Rourke." She turned, addressing the garage now instead of him. "This is exactly the kind of complacency I've been brought in to correct. 14 years of a man doing the bare minimum, and nobody thought to ask why he was never considered for anything more. That's a management failure, and I intend to fix it." She looked back at Sam. "You're done here." For a moment, nobody moved. Even the tablet woman looked up, startled out of whatever practiced blankness she wore for a living. Ms. Sinclair, one of the older mechanics, started. "I said he's done." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The stillness of the room did the work for her. Security will collect his badge and his tools, effective immediately. Across the bay, near the vending machines, Lily was sitting on an overturned crate with her backpack in her lap, waiting for the end of her father's shift so they could go get ice cream the way they did every other Tuesday. A small ritual that had survived 4 years and never once been broken. She was 8, and she did not fully understand what was happening, only that the tall woman in the expensive coat had made her father's face go very still in a way it never went at home, and that stillness frightened her more than shouting would have. Sam set down his wrench. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice, did not reach for his phone to record it the way 3 other men in the garage were already quietly doing. Did not do any of the things a smaller, angrier version of himself might once have done in a different life, in a different country. He simply nodded once, wiped his hands on the rag hanging from his belt, and said, "Understood." That single word, the calm of it, the total absence of protest, seemed to unsettle Adele Sinclair more than an argument would have. People who fought back, she understood. People who went quiet, she didn't, and not understanding something was, for a woman like her, its own kind of insult. "That's it," she said. "No excuses?" "Wouldn't change anything," Sam said. "Would it?" "No," she agreed, something flickering behind her eyes that might, in a different woman, have been the first faint symptom of doubt. "It wouldn't." She turned and walked away, already reaching for her phone, because in her mind the matter of Sam Rourke was already closed, filed, finished, a loose thread of underperformance she had located and cut. She did not look back to see the little girl slide off the crate and run to her father's side, small arms wrapping around his waist, face pressed into his stomach the way it had pressed into him at the funeral 4 years ago. "Dad," Lily whispered, "are we in trouble?" Sam knelt down, ignoring the 2 security guards already crossing the floor toward him, and put both hands on his daughter's shoulders, the burned one and the whole one equally gentle. "We're not in trouble. Grown-ups sometimes say things to make themselves feel bigger. It doesn't mean it's true." "But," she said, "you weren't good at your job." "She said a lot of things," Sam said, something passing over his face for just a second. The specific tiredness of a man underestimated by power so often it stopped landing as an insult and became just weather. "None of them change what I know about myself. Come on, let's get your bag." The 2 security guards looked uncomfortable about the whole thing, but orders were orders, so they walked Sam Rourke out of the garage he had worked in for 14 years with his daughter's hand in his and a small cardboard box under one arm, past the row of mechanics who wouldn't meet his eyes. Out into a gray morning that didn't care what had just happened inside. He thought, as he buckled Lily into the truck, that this would be the end of it. A bad Tuesday. A story he'd tell in a few years with the sting long since sanded off by time. He did not know that Adele Sinclair was not, in fact, finished with him, that a woman who mistakes cruelty for standards rarely stops at a single cut. The drive home was quiet. Lily fell asleep against the window before they'd even cleared the parking lot, and Sam drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting, without quite meaning to, over the old scar. He did not sleep well that night. He lay in the dark, running through the day, looking for the mistake, the thing he should have done differently, and finding each time that there wasn't one. The escalation began the way these things always begin, with paperwork, which is to say, with someone deciding that humiliation wasn't complete until it had a signature on it. 2 days after Sam was walked out, he got a call from payroll informing him his final check would be delayed pending an internal review of equipment discrepancies. A phrase so vague, Sam almost laughed. He hadn't taken so much as a spare bolt home in 14 years, which was precisely why the accusation was useful to whoever authorized it, not because it was true, but because... He called the payroll office back and asked, calmly, what specifically was under review. He was told someone would follow up. Nobody followed up. He drove to the garage on the 3rd day, not to make a scene, but because 2 weeks' pay was the difference between making rent and not. He asked to speak to someone in HR. He was told Ms. Sinclair had left instructions that any former employee attempting to re-enter the facility should be treated as a trespassing risk, and two of the same guards who'd walked him out, visibly unhappy about it this time. "Do you know who authorized that memo?" one of them muttered. "Signed it herself. Guess she wanted to make a point." "What point?" Sam said, more tired than angry. "That you don't push back," the guard said. "It's about making sure nobody gets the idea that you can." Sam sat in his truck in that parking lot for 11 minutes before he started the engine, doing the math on what withheld pay meant for a man with one daughter and no cushion. The arithmetic folded in on itself the way it always does for people one bad month from the edge, every solution requiring a resource you don't have. What he didn't know, what he would not learn until later from Priya, was that Adele Sinclair had personally reviewed the security footage from his firing, not out of guilt, but out of irritation. She had watched, on a loop, the moment Sam absorbed her contempt without flinching, and something about that unbothered calm had gotten under her skin. People who fought her, she could defeat. People who simply declined to be moved by her, frightened her, so she dug in. She had her assistant draft a memo suggesting Rourke's pattern of underperformance warranted a formal note in his file, the sort that would make future employers quietly pass him over without ever having to say why it was not illegal. It was engineered cruelty, the kind that leaves no fingerprints. Word got around, as it does in a mid-sized city's trucking industry. 2 shops quietly declined to interview Sam that week, citing scheduling conflicts that weren't real, the residue of a powerful woman's displeasure. Lily noticed the change in her father before she understood its cause. He was quieter at dinner. One night, she found him at the table with a stack of bills spread in front of him, and she climbed into the chair across from him without a word and put her small hand over his scarred one. "Is it because of the mean lady?" she asked. "Some of it," Sam admitted, because he had promised Anna he would keep the ground steady under his daughter, not that he would lie to her. Grown-ups sometimes hold on to being angry longer than they should. It's not about you, it's not really even about me. It's about her needing to feel like she won something. Did she win? Sam thought about that for a long moment, turning his coffee mug slowly on the table, and when he answered, his voice had the particular evenness of a man choosing every word on purpose. "No," he said. "Winning means you get something you actually wanted. All she got was quieter. That's not winning. That's just noise settling." The following week brought a second blow, smaller but sharper, because it landed on someone Sam cared about. Priya had quietly asked her own supervisor whether anyone would address how the firing had been handled, and word made its way back to Adele's office by day's end. She was reassigned to a shift so early and isolated everyone understood the message, and she quit 2 weeks later anyway. Sam heard about it secondhand, and it bothered him more than his own situation did. Priya hadn't chosen composure the way he had. She'd simply been punished for noticing something wrong. It was, in fact, in exactly that period, while Sam was learning to stretch a diminished budget across a full month, and Adele Sinclair was drafting memos designed to make sure he never worked in the trade again, that the first thread of the truth began. Ray Delgado had been a paramedic for 22 years, and most of the wrecks he'd worked had long since blurred together into a single gray composite in his memory. But one night, 4 years back now, had never blurred, the night of the Halloway Bridge. He happened to be in the break room of a walk-in clinic that Wednesday, half watching the local news scroll a segment about Sinclair Freight's newest contract, when the anchor cut to a photo of Adele Sinclair at a ribbon cutting, poised and untouchable, and Ray nearly dropped his coffee because he recognized her, not from the news, but from underneath a different kind of light entirely. The strobing blue-red wash of emergency vehicles on a rain-slick bridge, her face slack and gray, her pulse thready under his 2 fingers. He had been the first paramedic on scene that night. It was in that same week that Priya, now unemployed, ran into Ray's daughter at a laundromat and mentioned, almost as an aside, the strange, quiet mechanic with the burn scar who'd been fired for no reason by the new CEO. Ray's daughter mentioned it to her father over dinner, mostly because the detail of the scar had stuck with her. Ray went very still. "What did you say his hand looked like?" he asked, because Ray Delgado had never forgotten the man's hand. He had been the one crouched at the edge of the wreck that night, screaming instructions across the rain at a stranger who had already wrenched open a jammed door with his bare hands and gone into the fire after a woman he had never met. Ray had grabbed that stranger's arm as he pulled Adele Sinclair's body clear of the flames, had seen the skin of his right hand blistering even as the man kept pulling, and had shouted, "What's your name?" "I need it for the report," and the man had only shaken his head, confirmed she was breathing, and vanished into the chaos before the second ambulance arrived, so completely gone that for weeks afterward Ray had wondered if shock had invented a hero. He had not imagined it. And now, 4 years later, he was hearing a second-hand description of a scar that matched, detail for detail, the wound he'd personally bandaged in the back of his ambulance. In the morning, he made 2 calls, one to confirm a name, one to an old newspaper contact who owed him a favor, to see if the archives still had the photograph. They did. It had run once, 3 days after the crash, a grainy shot of the wreckage, and in the corner of the frame, half turned from the camera, a man in a Soaks jacket with his right hand wrapped in gauze disappearing into the crowd. The caption read, "Anonymous rescuer flees, scene of fatal pileup, 1 survivor critical." It had been forgotten by everyone except the handful of people whose lives it had actually touched. Ray printed the photograph and drove to Sam Rourke's address, holding 4 years of an unanswered question in his hands. Sam opened the door. He looked for just a moment at the paramedic he did not immediately recognize, and then at the photograph the man was holding out to him. Faded and grainy and unmistakably the worst night of his own quiet private history, and something in his face, the same face that had not flinched under Adele Sinclair's contempt, that had absorbed public humiliation without so much as a raised voice, finally, quietly, came apart. "I've been trying to find you for 4 years, Ray Delgado said. I need you to tell me if this is your hand." Sam looked down at his own scar, pale and old in the porch light, and then back up at Ray, and for a long moment neither man said anything at all, because both of them understood in the particular silent way that people who have stood at the edge of death together always understand each other, exactly what this conversation was going to cost. And exactly why it had to happen anyway. "Yeah," Sam said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "That's my hand." What Ray Delgado didn't know yet, what nobody but Sam himself carried, folded away in a part of his mind he rarely let himself open, was the whole of that night, the actual weight of it, and it deserves to be told now in full exactly as it happened. It had been raining for 6 straight hours before the crash, the kind of steady, grinding rain that turns a highway into a river with painted lines on it, and Sam had been driving home from a late shift at another garage, back when Anna was still alive and pregnant with Lily. The Halloway Bridge, that night, was a 2-lane crossing over a black, swollen river, visibility down to a car and a half, and somewhere in the middle of it, a delivery truck hydroplaned into the oncoming lane. Sam heard it before he saw it, a sound like the sky itself, tearing metal, folding into metal at highway speed. Then the screaming started, and the smell reached him. Gasoline and hot metal and something electrical burning, and by the time he brought his own truck to a stop, 3 vehicles were tangled together in the center of the bridge. He was out of his truck before he had fully decided to be. His body simply moved, cataloging the scene the way he'd been taught to catalog any chaotic space: exits, threats, survivors, sequence. 2 people were already stumbling clear of a pickup, dazed but upright. Not the priority. It was the 3rd car, a sedan pinned against the guardrail with flames licking up from under the hood. He could see a shape behind the wheel, still not moving. He ran through rain that hit like static, reached the driver's door and found it jammed, buckled inward by the impact. The heat off the hood had gone past uncomfortable into something that made the skin on his arms tighten in warning. He hooked his fingers into the folded seam and pulled with everything the years had built into him, and on the 3rd pull, the door screamed open on its ruined hinge. The heat inside the car was worse. Flame had found the dashboard wiring and was crawling, patient and orange, toward the seat. The woman behind the wheel, young, dark-haired, blood running from a cut above her eyebrow, was unconscious. Her seatbelt jammed the same way the door had been, and Sam had maybe 4 seconds before the fire stopped being something you could reach through and started being something that simply took the car and everyone in it. He didn't remember deciding to reach across her and rip the seatbelt free with his bare hand. He remembered the belt not giving and then giving, and he remembered the moment his right hand, braced against the dashboard for leverage, found the spreading flame instead of metal. The pain arriving, not as pain exactly, but as a kind of white total noise his trained mind simply filed away, and now required both his hands. He got his arms under her and pulled her free in one motion that used every muscle he had, stumbled back with her weight collapsed against his chest, and made it perhaps 15 feet before the flames found the fuel line and the sedan went up in a rush of orange that lit the whole bridge like a struck match. He laid her down on the wet asphalt, checked her pulse against her throat, thready, but there, and became aware, all at once, that his right hand had burned badly enough. The skin had begun to blister. A paramedic reached them, then, shouting over the rain, asking his name, and Sam Rourke, trained so thoroughly in the discipline of leaving no trace that the habit had outlived its reasons, simply shook his head, confirmed with a glance that she was breathing, and stepped back into the dark, disappearing before anyone thought to stop him. Driving himself one-handed to a clinic 40 minutes away, rather than risk the questions an ambulance intake would ask. He never went back to check on her. He told himself in the months after that it was better this way, that whoever she was, she had people, resources, a life that would close back over the wound of that night the way water closes over a stone. He had done, in his mind, only what any decent person should do. He had no idea driving home that night with his hand wrapped in a gas station first aid kit and Anna waiting up worried on the porch, that the woman he'd pulled from that fire would one day stand in a garage 4 years later, Ray Delgado sat with Sam Rourke on the small front porch for a long while after Sam finished telling him all of it, and when Sam finally stopped talking, Ray just shook his head slowly, the particular disbelief of a man who has spent 22 years around trauma and still, occasionally. "She never knew your name," Ray said. "She spent 4 years not knowing. I've seen the interviews. She talks about that night, sometimes says she owes her life to a stranger she never got to thank, says it's the one thing money never fixed for her." He looked at Sam's hand. "And she fired you for being invisible." "She doesn't know," Sam said quietly. "That's not an excuse. It's just the truth. She was cruel to a man she didn't know was the reason she's alive. That's not poetic justice. That's just what cruelty does. It doesn't check first." "You're not going to tell her it wasn't quite a question." Sam looked out at the quiet street, at Lily's bicycle tipped over in the small front yard, and took a long moment before he answered. "I didn't pull her out of that car so that 4 years later I'd have something to hold over her. That's not what it was for. If it comes out, it comes out. But I'm not going to be the one who makes it about me." Ray Delgado left that night with the photograph, and with the particular unrest of a man who has just watched decency refuse to cash in a debt it was owed. Suspecting the universe rarely leaves a debt like that unpaid for long. He was right, because Ray, unlike Sam, had no promise to keep about staying quiet. It started small. Ray mentioned it to his supervisor at the clinic, who happened to sit on a community hospital board with 2 members of the Sinclair Freight Board of Directors, and mentioned it over coffee 3 days later as an almost unbelievable footnote. One of those board members, a woman named Constance Ahn, who had been quietly documenting complaints against Adele for over a year, filed the detail away the way a careful person files away anything that might one day matter. It mattered 4 days later when the board convened for a routine quarterly review, and Constance raised her hand and asked Adele, in front of everyone, whether she was aware that the mechanic she'd terminated the week before was the same anonymous man who had pulled her from the wreckage on the Halloway Bridge 4 years earlier. The room went silent. In a way, Adele Sinclair had never once experienced from the head of a boardroom table. She had built part of her public identity on that bridge, the rare vulnerability of having survived something and not knowing who to thank for it. A story she told at galas because it made her seem, briefly, human. And now a member of her own board was telling her that the someone she'd needed had been standing in her own garage, and that she had fired him. "That's not possible," she said, and her voice, for the first time anyone in that room could recall, did not sound certain. "There's a photograph," Constance said. "There's a paramedic. And there are at least 3 cell phone videos of you telling a 14-year employee his burn scar was a convenient story. The same scar the newspaper shows wrapped in gauze the night he vanished from that bridge. I'd sit with that before deciding how you'd like to respond." Adele Sinclair did not respond well. Nobody does in the first instant of learning that the worst thing they've done recently. She left the boardroom without finishing the meeting. She drove herself, waving off her driver for the first time in 6 years, to the address her assistant had pulled from an old HR file, and sat outside Sam Rourke's small apartment for 11 minutes, before she found the nerve to get out. The same 11 minutes Sam had once sat outside her garage's parking lot, though neither would ever know that quiet symmetry. Sam opened the door and, for the second time in a week, found someone standing on his porch holding a piece of the worst night of his life. This time, it was Adele Sinclair, without her assistant, without her driver, without the coat and the certainty, standing in ordinary daylight looking for the first time since Sam had known of her. "Is it true?" she said. Not a demand. Barely even a question. More like a woman testing whether a floor she'd trusted her whole life was actually going to hold her weight. "Is what true?" Sam said, though he already knew. And something in his calm, even now, was not cruelty. It was simply the same discipline that had carried him through a burning car and a public firing alike, no matter how much they might deserve to see it crack. "The bridge," she said. "4 years ago, was it you?" Sam held up his right hand, palm out, the old scar catching the afternoon light the way it had once caught the fluorescent lights of her garage, the way it had once caught the orange of a burning car. "Yeah," he said. Adele Sinclair did not cry, not there on the porch, not yet. But something in her face went through a series of small collapses, like a structure, finding it could no longer hold the shape it had been built to hold, and she sat down, without asking, on the top step of Sam Rourke's porch. "I fired you," she said very quietly, mostly to herself. "I told a room full of people your scar was a convenient lie. I had payroll withhold your check." She looked up at him, her eyes genuinely, helplessly wet. "You pulled me out of a fire, and 4 years later I did that to you, and you never said a word. You could have told me, and I would have had no choice but to." "To what?" Sam said, not unkindly. "I don't want anything from you that you didn't already owe every other person you fired that day. I'm not a special case. I'm just the one you happened to find out about." That sentence would follow Adele Sinclair for a long time afterward, longer even than the scandal that was already, without either of their input, beginning to spread. Because the same cell phone footage from the garage, once paired with the story of the bridge, had, by that evening, found its way onto local news. And by the next morning, onto accounts with considerably more reach. A billionaire CEO had humiliated the anonymous stranger who saved her life, mocked the very scar that proved it, and then tried to bury him in paperwork, and then tried to bury him in paperwork. It did not matter that Sam Rourke had never once wanted the story told. Stories like that do not ask permission from the people at their center. The consequences, once they began, within 72 hours of the board meeting, 2 members resigned in protest of a pattern of managerial conduct inconsistent with the values of the organization. Language that meant, in plainer terms, that Adele Sinclair's cruelty had finally become too expensive to keep quiet about. A major shipping contract was quietly pulled by a client who did not want their name associated with the headlines. Sinclair freight stock slid 9% in 4 trading days, because the market had learned that a company whose CEO makes national news for humiliating her own rescuer. The board voted to place her on an indefinite leave of absence, pending a full review of conduct complaints. 11 of them, it turned out, had been quietly filed against her in the 18 months since she'd taken the chair. She was not criminally charged. Withholding a paycheck under a manufactured pretext was a civil matter, one Sam's new lawyer settled within 2 weeks for the full amount owed, plus a sum large enough to make clear the company wanted the matter gone from the headlines. But money was never really the story. The real cost to Adele Sinclair was the specific, public, permanent unraveling of the one story she had ever told about herself that made her seem human. The bridge, the fire, the debt she owed a stranger, now revealed to the entire internet as a story she had without knowing it, personally desecrated. Sam did none of it on purpose. He gave no interviews. When a producer from a national morning show offered him a genuinely enormous sum of money to tell his side on camera, he said no, and then said no again, and then stopped answering the number entirely. He had spent his whole adult life training himself out of wanting to be seen, and the sudden attention of being cast as a folk hero sat on him about as comfortably as a coat 2 sizes too small. What he wanted, in the middle of all of it, was to sit at his own kitchen table with his daughter and eat dinner like it was an ordinary Tuesday, which was, in the end, exactly what he did. It was on one of those evenings, about a week after the story broke wide, that Lily finally asked him the question she'd clearly been carrying around for days, turning it over the way she turned over most hard things, quietly and at her own pace, waiting for the right moment to set it down on the table between them. "Everyone at school is saying you're a hero," she said, pushing peas around her plate. "Some kid said you should sue her for $1 million. Are you going to?" Sam considered the question with the full seriousness it deserved, because he had promised Anna he would never make his daughter feel small for asking a real question. "No," he said. "I'm not going to sue her. She was really mean to you in front of everybody, in front of me." "She was," Sam agreed. "There's a difference, baby, between wanting someone to feel what they made you feel and wanting things to actually be fair. Revenge feels like justice for about 5 minutes. Then you're just carrying one more heavy thing, except now it's a thing you chose to pick up yourself." He set down his fork. "Being strong doesn't mean you hit back as hard as you got hit. Anybody can do that if they're angry enough. Being strong means you choose what you do with what you know, even when it could really hurt somebody." Especially then, Lily thought about that for a long moment. "So you knew you could really hurt her," she said. "The whole time you already knew about the fire and everything, and you didn't say it, even though it would have made her stop being mean right away. I didn't say it." Lily was quiet for a moment, turning her fork over in her small hands, and then she said the thing Sam Rourke would carry with him longer than almost anything else from that whole strange month. "That's kind of like when you save somebody and don't tell them," she said, "except this time you saved her from being the meanest version of herself, even though she didn't deserve it. You just did it anyway, like the bridge, but slower." Sam did not have an answer for that right away. He felt something move through his chest. He hadn't fully felt since the day of Anna's funeral, the tenderness of realizing his daughter had understood better than most adults ever managed to, exactly what he had been trying to do. "Yeah," he finally said, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. "Something like that. Is that why you don't get mad, even when people are really mean?" "I get mad," Sam admitted. "I just don't let the mad decide what happens next." "Your mom used to say, 'Anger is a good alarm and a bad driver, useful for telling you something's wrong. Terrible at deciding what to do about it.'" Lily nodded slowly, filing that away the serious way she filed most things her father told her. "I'm glad you're my dad," she said between bites of a dinner that was getting cold, "even though the mean lady said you weren't good at anything." She didn't say that. She basically said that. "She was wrong," Sam said. "About a lot of things, but mostly about that." The redemption, when it came, did not arrive as a single dramatic gesture, because real change in a person rarely does. It arrives in increments, in small corrected behaviors that only add up to something over months. And Adele Sinclair's slow turning was in the end exactly that kind of arrival. She spent 6 weeks on leave, sitting with a version of herself she did not particularly like. She met with a therapist Constance recommended, and in the first sessions she mostly talked about the business, the stock price, the optics, until the therapist finally asked her, plainly, why she seemed more upset about what the world thought of her than about what she'd done to a man who once nearly died saving her life. Adele sat in stunned silence because she did not have a good answer, and some part of her recognized that not having one was itself the answer. She began in those sessions to talk about her own father, the man who had built Sinclair Freight, and the lesson he had taught her without meaning to, that softness was a liability, that people who survived in that world. She had absorbed it so completely she no longer recognized it as a lesson. It had simply become who she was. None of that excused it. Understanding was not an apology. She wrote Sam a letter, an actual handwritten letter, 3 pages, that took her 4 attempts, because every earlier draft had still, somewhere in it, been quietly asking him to forgive her. The final draft asked for nothing. It told him what she now understood, that she had spent years mistaking coldness for competence, building a reputation for standards that were really just cruelty wearing a suit, and that meeting the man she owed her life to, only to discover she'd already failed every test of decency he might have measured her against, had cost her something she was only beginning to name. Sam read it once at his kitchen table, and answered 3 weeks later in 4 sentences. He accepted that she meant it. Meaning it and proving it were 2 different things, and only one counted. Priya and the others who'd lost hours in the fallout deserved whatever restitution she could give, more than he needed anything further. And he hoped she found some peace in it, because carrying that shame forever helped nobody. Adele did prove it in the unglamorous way proof actually takes. She returned to a company under new board oversight and pushed through a formal grievance process with actual teeth. She personally called Priya, apologized without qualification, and offered her old job back at a raise that had nothing to do with guilt. She authorized full restitution to every employee affected, quietly, without a press release, because, for once, she was doing something not to manage how she looked, but because it was owed. It took the better part of a year, and it did not look, from outside, like a redemption arc. Real redemption rarely does. It looks like a person being less cruel on a Tuesday than the Tuesday before, and doing it again the week after, until it stops being a performance and becomes simply who they are. Sam did not go back to Sinclair Freight. That chapter had closed the day. Security walked him across the parking lot. He took a job instead at a smaller independent shop 2 towns over, run by a retired Army mechanic named Wallace who didn't care about any of it except that Sam showed up on time and did honest work, which was, in the end, all Sam had ever wanted from an employer. It was nearly a year later, on an ordinary Saturday with no cameras and no headlines, that Lily, 9, now having had a birthday in the interim, that Sam had marked, as he marked every year. Which ridge? Sam asked, though he already suspected. The one from the story, the Halloway one. I want to see it. They drove out on a clear afternoon, the river beneath the bridge, calm and unremarkable in ordinary daylight, nothing like the black swollen thing it had been on the night that started all of this. Lily stood at the railing for a long time, looking down at water that had long since forgotten what had happened above it. And then she looked up at her father's scarred hand resting on the rail beside her. "Does it still hurt?" she asked. "The scar?" "Not anymore," Sam said. "Not the way it used to." "Good," Lily said. And then, after a moment, in the simple, unornamented way, she said the things that mattered most. "I'm glad you were brave that night. Even though it hurt you and you didn't get anything for it." She slipped her small hand into his larger scarred one and looked back out at the water. "I think that's the best kind of brave, the kind nobody sees." Sam Rourke stood on that bridge with his daughter's hand in his, in a silence that held no bitterness left in it at all, and understood, more clearly than at any point in the whole long unraveling of that year, that a man and his daughter on a quiet bridge on an ordinary Saturday, had been the entire point of everything he had ever refused to trade away, long before anyone knew his name. He thought about the promise he'd made Anna in that vinyl chair 4 years earlier, and how strange it was that keeping a promise about steadiness had led him through a firing, a scandal, and out the other side of it to this precise spot. The discipline that pulled a woman from a burning car, and the discipline that let a man absorb a public firing without breaking, were underneath it all. Exactly the same muscle, built the same way, for the same quiet reason. There is a version of this story where Sam Rourke sues for everything he can get, takes the enormous check, and becomes a minor celebrity. Nobody would have blamed him for it, but it would not have been the story that actually happened, because the truest measure of a person is rarely what they do when the world is watching. It is what they choose not to do when no one would ever have known the difference. If you have ever been made to feel small by someone who mistook their power for permission, you already understand something Sam Rourke has known for a long time. Dignity is not loud. It does not announce itself, does not demand an audience, does not need the person who wronged you to witness your comeback in order for the comeback to be real. It shows up quietly in the choice to keep a promise someone made you long ago, in letting anger be information instead of instruction, in helping a stranger even when helping means you vanish from the story before you're ever thanked for it. Real strength rarely looks like the moment people expect it to. It looks like a man calmly nodding and saying "understood" in a room built to humiliate him. It looks like refusing revenge you could easily have justified. It looks like teaching a child that being strong means choosing, on purpose, what not to do, because anyone, furious enough, can strike back, but it takes something rarer to hold your power quietly. So ask yourself, tonight, honestly, the next time you are underestimated by someone who has no idea what you have already survived, what you are quietly capable of, what you have already given without asking for anything in return, whether they deserve it or not. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it.